Well, hello everyone, and welcome to Syria Face to Face. This is episode 11, and tonight we'll be discussing the role Israel has played in the conflict in Syria, as well as other conflicts in the Middle East, and particularly since 9/11. And so I hope you all are doing well. My name is Janice Kortkamp, and I'm coming to you live from Luckett's, Virginia tonight. As is typical, I think and ponder on these talks all week long, and I start several pages of notes and trying to organize my thoughts. Wow, welcome everyone. And as is also typical, at about 3:30 or so, I end up starting fresh and coming up with an approach that I think might work. So some of this will be off the cuff. And, I apologize again for presenting material to you that is not as organized as I would like it to be. But we're going to jump in anyway and see what we can do here. So good evening. Tonight, as I was thinking about all of this, and as I said in the announcement, entire libraries are full of information and resources about Israel, about the Middle East, about the conflicts there. I feel like I could fill an entire library just on the current the war in Syria. And so it's very, very difficult to kind of try to compress and condense this. And so the approach that I'm going to take tonight is really part one of what must be at least two parts, because I really felt like I needed to build a foundation of kind of a general overview, if you will, and to use that then to talk specifically about the role of Israel in the war against Syria and in other conflicts going on in the region right now next time. I won't have a Syria face-to-face next Sunday. I will be visiting my 96-year-old mother, and I don't want to do anything but focus on her and the other family that I'll be visiting there. So the next episode will not be next Sunday, but the following Sunday, and that will give me some time to hopefully prepare a good presentation for you. I don't know if everybody is familiar with what are called magic eye pictures, and I'll be looking over here because I've got my notes on one side and you on this side. But a magic eye picture is one of those. It's a big picture, and it looks like it's just filled with kind of random repeating images or abstract designs, and it just, it's just repeat, repeat, repeat. But what it is really is there's a hidden three-dimensional picture within the big picture. And when you know how to look at the picture and you do it the right way, all of a sudden an image will just pop out of the screen or of the page, and you'll see a large image forming that you just can't believe that you missed before. And this is, I think, a good illustration of what I found over the years of researching the war in Syria. And then that kind of, I was basically, when you go to look at one of those pictures, you have to kind of put your nose right to the picture and focus on one point, and then you back up your face, and all of a sudden you get a little kind of dizzy and your eyes go a little bit cross-eyed, and then the picture pops out. And that's what it's been like for me studying these conflicts in the Middle East. I've been shocked at the level of my own ignorance. And so forgive me, forgive me for speaking in very simplistic terms, but really I'm trying to share things in a way that I think other Americans who do not have a foundation in this issue might be able to relate to. So that's kind of the overview of tonight. As I became obsessed with Syria, like I said, I started researching all of the other conflicts in the region. So that meant, what had happened in Iraq and Lebanon and what had just happened in Libya. But of course, the epicenter of it all is the Palestine-Israel conflict. And, you know, as I was looking and had my nose up to Syria and trying to step back and look at these other conflicts, the image that popped out, the picture that popped out that I didn't really understand before and hadn't a clue of before, was how as I pulled on each and every thread, as I looked at each and everything, there was always some, not just connection to the modern Zionist government state of Israel, but a direct relationship. And, you know, I just kept looking at all of those, pulling on those threads, as well as researching, you know, what the Palestinians had been going through, what had happened there. And it was just kind of this brutal revelation, one after another. And, you know, what I realized was that for the past 70 years, here in America especially, there's been this kind of both overt and subliminal propaganda that has been fed to us. I say like fluoride in the water. You know, it's just been kind of a part of things here for so long that many people had gotten to the point where they weren't even questioning some of the basic narratives that had been perpetuated, that were continually put before us as facts. Before 9/11, there was still quite a bit of, you know, there was room there. There were people that were talking. Of course, there have always been activists, which I'm so grateful for their work over all these years. But after 9/11, all discussion, all criticism just seemed to stop for the most part. And I'm talking in the mainstream cultural conversation. And after 9/11, it just seemed like there was this permanent weld done between Israel's interests and American interests. And as one person described it, I think it was Colonel Larry Wilkerson, you know, there's no light that shines between the two, that it has become considered as one. And this has caused particularly even more devastating consequences in the region, and as well as for America as well. So this is so critical to understand, because Americans are absolutely brainwashed. We've been brainwashed for generations, and we're told that we mustn't look at these issues, that we mustn't worry about what's going on over there, you know, we have to leave it to our government, blah, blah, blah. But in reality, it's affected our country also in devastating ways. And we'll talk a little bit about that, if not tonight, in the next segment. So hello, everyone, again. And oh, yay, it's great to see people from Syria there. Hello, friends. You know, what's so important about this is that these conflicts and wars that have been going on in the region really don't make any sense until you finally figure this out, that for 70 years, you've been force-fed narratives that literally have tried to make wrong right. Once you see it, once that picture pops out to you, all of a sudden, everything going on makes total sense. And the underlying realities, the underlying situations and problems are actually very easy to identify. It's complicated, of course, lots of history there, but the basic underlying conflict becomes very clear. Hello, everyone, again. Okay, so I've spoken too generally, I think, but you know, one of the things that we have to get out of the way as we talk about Israel and criticize Israel, which I will be doing in very blunt terms tonight, is this accusation that if you criticize Israel, you're being anti-Semitic, quote unquote. I don't even use the term anti-Semitic anymore because I find that in itself misleading. What's confusing is, you know, the Arabs, the Palestinians, many of the people groups in the region are far more Semitic than most of the Jews that have come into Israel. They use that term to say it's defined that they speak Hebrew and they're united by speaking the Hebrew language, for example, which is a Semitic language, but so too is Arabic. So it's not a term that is specific enough. And I think that we need to change our language, that when we're talking about people who hate Jews, and there are many who truly do hate Jews, then we need to call them anti-Jewish as opposed to anti-Semitic. Let's get our language specific. I am not anti-Jewish. If there was such a thing as a CAT scan device that could scan your body and your mind and your heart and look for you know, anti-Jewish feeling, you would not find any within me. Sid and I both, we love people. And that's who we are. We love people. We don't care what religion they are, if they don't have a religion, you know, what color they are, any of that. We love people. And so I'm not anti-Jewish. However, nor do I believe that Jewish blood is inherently more precious than the blood of other people. And I find myself kind of having this reaction now at this necessity that we seem to be required to value Jewish blood and also American blood over blood of other people. And I reject that notion completely. People talk about denying the Holocaust, or, you know, you want another Holocaust, and that's nonsense as well. What I also have a reaction to now is the Holocaust, you know, capital T, capital H, trademark, copyright, all rights reserved, all profits to go to bribing politicians to support the pro-Israel lobby, as Norman Finkelstein called it, the you know, the Holocaust industry. I think this too cheapens the blood of other people who have been spilled in attempted genocides. And attempted genocides have occurred throughout history and around the world. And each and every time, the result is disaster, is brutality beyond anything that we can imagine. But this idea that there is one and only one attempted genocide in history is a false narrative that is basically pushed upon us in order to create an exaggerated sensitivity and sympathy for Jews and therefore for Israel. So I hope that clears up where I'm coming from there. We have now 70 years of data since Israel was founded in 1948. And that gives us the ability to really look back through that history to find out what the patterns are of its existence. And we need to look at these patterns if we're going to figure out what may be coming next. And this is very important when it relates to the war in Syria and around in the region. So we're going to work on this for a little bit. How are we all doing, everybody? Is this going okay so far? So we're talking about patterns, and as I look back through the history of this modern Zionist entity that's called Israel, these patterns have become obvious, and I have been able to draw certain conclusions. And I believe that I was an unbiased researcher and went in with quite fresh eyes. And, I just kept looking at these key narratives of the situation and things that I've done in my research about Syria as well. So, for example, in Syria, you have the perpetual, oh, the war started when President Assad brutally put down peaceful protesters. And that line was included in almost every single media article and television episode or program about it. I have proven to myself, and I believe that it's very easily proven, that that is a false narrative. So I use that same mentality looking at these narratives regarding Israel and the Zionists. And what I have seen, to put it very bluntly and simply, is that basically for 70 years, there's been a wolf that's been covered in sheep's clothing, and we've been told that that's a sheep, that's something that must be protected and guarded and all of these things. But the patterns in the history suggest something very different, and that, in fact, that Israel is the wolf in the region. So, for example, one of the common myths, and I'm talking about the myths that are spread here in America, as if they were written by the finger of God himself. I don't think this is necessarily as true in Europe, but here, Americans tend to be very simple people. We're loyal people. We're much more like dogs and cats in general. And so, these sound bites, these narratives have been kept very simple. So one of the myths was that, that Israel was founded in this land, Palestine, because Palestine was a land without a people for a people without a land. And as I have been looking through history books and researching this, it boggles my mind that this kind of lie could be perpetuated. Palestine was existed. There was over 1 million people there in 1931, according to the British census. They had been there forever. They had, when I look back on the photographs of the culture of Palestine, and I have so much greater appreciation for it, having been into the region and experienced the hospitality, the food, the gatherings of the families, the love of education, just the daily lives of people, whether they're in the cities or in the villages. All of this existed in Palestine before this experiment started in 1948 called Israel. So that basic myth needs to be completely busted in people's minds. Another common myth that we are kind of taught here, believe it or not, I mean, you guys in the region and of the region and people who know this history will be shocked, but most Americans, I would say, think Israel was created because of the Holocaust. Capital T, capital H, trademark, all rights reserved. In fact, of course, I'm sure most of my viewers know that the Zionists started the project to create a Jewish homeland back in the late 1800s. It was always a political movement. Most of the people involved were total atheists. And it was always a movement, the Zionist movement, that was intended to, in my opinion, kind of hijack Judaism in order to further its goals. And its goals were very ambitious. And many of the early founders and the leaders both before the beginning of Israel in 1948, throughout the course of its history, have supported, and passionately so, the idea that is called Greater Israel, the Greater Israel Project. And this is basically an Israel, a Jewish Israel, that extends from the Nile River to the Euphrates River. For example, Benjamin Netanyahu's father, who was born in Cleveland, Ohio, was a passionate supporter of the Greater Israel Project. How that is important, why that is so important to understand, is that many of the leaders and the people in the region, we're learning about Zionism and we're learning about its goals, and knew then, as they have known throughout these last 70 years, that the intention of the Zionists was to expand. And I'm going to be putting up on my Syria Resources website a complete list of resources that backs up what I'm saying, but I don't want to get mired down in that right now, but I do have all the resources to back up what I'm saying. And basically the intention was whatever land they were given by the Brits, by the consensus of the global powers that existed, was that would be a beachhead. And that, the intention was, of course, to expand throughout all of the Palestinian land, but also neighboring countries as well, including the Sinai, Lebanon, Syria, much of Jordan, into Iraq. So, this plan was well known. This plan was stated in public ways. People knew about this plan, and yet, by some miracle, I guess, the Brits and the Americans thought that, the Arabs were going to just roll over on their back like submissive dogs and let the Zionists take over the region. And of course, when you're dealing with people who truly do have those deep roots that go back uncounted generations, some of them, their families, well, they've just been there forever. When you have that kind of true connection to the land, and you're not some Polish Jew from Cleveland, Ohio, coming in, that creates a strength and a determination that cannot be equaled by anything else, in my opinion. The people there are the land is the people, and that it's just this, this kind of one being. So the idea that those people who are of that region would allow this group that primarily consists of people from Europe and Russia and America to come in and take over the place is, it's guaranteed to end in total disaster. And we're seeing right now where a lot of it is coming to a head. And this is why it is of urgent importance for people to bust through these myths and to stop believing these lies and to understand what's really at stake and what's really been happening. Another myth, of course, which is a huge one that's been used continually, is that the Arabs are the terrorists in the region. The Arabs started terrorism. I think very few Americans are familiar with the history of the Jewish terrorist groups, the Zionist terrorists, that were so active and so brutal in the years right before 1948 and in that whole era. The Irgun and the Stern Gang should be known to every student of history, and yet you can go through your entire school career and college and never hear of those two groups. The Irgun and the Stern Gang, of course, were like I said, Jewish terrorist gangs, and they were trying to drive the British out of Palestine so that they could have freedom to do whatever they wanted to the Palestinians, and to also terrify the Palestinians and get them submissive to their aggression and their rule. So you had these two terrorist groups, and in fact, later Israeli prime ministers, Menachem Begin was a member of the Irgun, and Yitzhak, sorry for my pronunciation, Yitzhak Shamir, also another later prime minister of Israel, was a member of the Stern Gang. And these people bragged about being involved in these terrorist groups and these terrorist activities. What's key to understanding here, I think, for the current time, is because their terrorism did succeed in driving the British out. Guess what? That becomes the model for the Palestinians and the Arabs to then attempt to drive out their occupiers. And it does not surprise me in the least that there are people in the Middle East and in Palestine that choose to use terrorist attacks to try to achieve their political ends, because that is how Israel was founded, was by the Jews doing terrorist acts to get the British out. It worked for them, you know, and I don't approve of terrorism in any way. I don't, I don't support that, but I do understand that. And I do understand how desperation and frustration could have led some people within Palestine to think of that as a viable alternative. Just to go into some detail about the Irgun and the Stern gangs, you know, many people know about the King David Hotel bombing, and this was in 1946, and Menachem Begin and the other gang members, you know, they actually dressed as Arabs to try to frame Arabs for this bombing, and they blew up the King David Hotel and killed many Brits, Americans, Arabs, etc. And they killed about 100 people that day. They were trying, like I said, to frame it on the Arabs, but that didn't work, and everybody knew that they were the ones who did it. So that's just one of many terrorist activities that they did. They, I think there's something like 24 or more specific terrorist attacks that have been attributed to them before 1948. I could be wrong about the number. I'll double check on that. One of the most horrific, hi Lynn, hi everybody. One of the most horrific terrorist attacks, of course, was the massacre of a peaceful village outside of Jerusalem called Deir Yassin. And in this village that had peacefully coexisted with Jewish neighbors, Jewish villages and areas nearby, was attacked by the Irgun and the Stern Gang. A terrible, brutal massacre of this little village. I think there were like 600 people in the village. This was in 1947, I think. The Red Cross representative at the time, you know, they were trying to do body counts, but the Jewish terrorists had burned a lot of the bodies, and it's difficult to get an accurate total final count. But in just one cistern, the Red Cross representative counted 150 bodies, many women and children. People had been disemboweled and decapitated. Just a horrific, horrible mess. And this, of course, you know, the word of this spread around and paved the way for Palestinians to be fearful of their lives from these terrorist groups. You know, people talk about how Israel bought land from the Palestinians, and some Palestinians did just sell it to to Israel, basically the Zionists. Others were terrified. Others were, you know, and of course forced out and killed. And that all led to a mass exodus from the area that became Israel in 1948 of 700,000 Palestinians from those lands. And they call it the catastrophe. And, you know, whole families were just forced to leave their homes. They carry their possessions on their backs, what have you. So the point being is that, you know, Israel was not founded as a bunch of little sheep that had survived the Holocaust and had come to this land to live in peace with their neighbors. But in fact, they had come to the land in order and were committing atrocities, were committing violence, were intending to expand the entire time. And, you know, and yet we are force-fed this idea that they just want peace. And I don't see any actual evidence that the leaders of Israel throughout the course of time, you know, there have been exceptions, that all of these leaders and the administrations over time have always wanted to expand, have always wanted to treat the Palestinians with violence, have always wanted to steal their land. And they actually, you know, in the process of stealing land, stealing personal property, killing people, they set about to literally destroy Palestinian heritage and history. And I think it was, might have been Moshe Dayan, but I can't remember, who said, you know, the intention was to obliterate these Palestinian villages, to wipe them out, maybe David Ben-Gurion, and to literally erase that history. And they would wipe out the villages, bulldoze the villages, destroy the villages, try to remove the name from the history books, just as they do today when they bulldoze ancient olive trees and you know, they're still bulldozing and destroying villages and wiping them out to create settlements, etc. So, you know, in addition, like I said, to the mass murders, to the terrifying of the population, to the expulsion of land that had been held by families for many generations, loss of their farms, loss of their livelihood, oftentimes loss of their lives outright. There's been a loss of heritage and history, and you'll find this again and again if you are debating with Zionists. There is this almost I can't really describe it. It's like literally beating your head up against a brick wall of arrogance and insistence that, like I said, wrong is right, black is white, etc. And, you know, they'll just tell you that there was no Palestine. Didn't exist. A fifth grader could spend 10 minutes on Google and find ancient maps that called the area Palestine. You know, there are surviving passports from Palestine, train tickets. You know, I mean, Palestine existed, and Palestine will exist, and Palestine will be free. And I believe this with all my heart. And I think if we just continually bust these myths with people and continue to change the cultural conversation, it is working, as a matter of fact. Israel is losing mind share here. It's losing support here in America. And this is where it's key that, you know, the people that say they support Israel kind of unconditionally has gone way down. That it supports it at all has gone down, even amongst the Jews. So this is a positive step in the right direction. So now we can get into a little bit of detail, and here we kind of go off the script because my script is over. And we'll talk a little bit about how this foundation of violence and expansionism, cloaked in lies, has affected how that has, what the role that has had in the in the war against Syria. Excuse my fumbling over my words. What we have now in America, like I said, especially since 9/11, has been this welding, absolute total welding of Israeli interests and what are called American interests when it comes to our government. And this has some fascinating and horrific history. When that started was actually decades ago. You know, Benjamin Netanyahu has been in power for about 20 years now. But he is part of a group of people that ascended to power here in America called the neocons. They're called neocons because they're new conservatives. They were of the Democratic Party. They switched party to the Republicans. Traditionally, you know, most Jews are Democrats and liberals, and they support Democrat and liberal politicians. The Zionists that wanted to really get more of a power base in the Republican Party became neocons. This neocon group that started coming really into power in the 80s and 90s are, you know, there's these core people. So you have the Kagan clan, Kagan. You have Donald Feith. You have Paul Wolfowitz, Donald Rumsfeld, Dick Cheney is one of the neocons, John Bolton, Jeb Bush. You know, I mean, it actually reads like a who's who of American politics. And these guys were rising up through the ranks and becoming more and more powerful behind the scenes in Washington and in the swamp, as we call it. And in the 1990s, some of these neocons, two of the big neocons, wrote a paper that was written for Benjamin Netanyahu and Israel as he was coming into power in Israel. And the paper was called A Clean Break and, you know, Strategy for Defending the Realm, which is an odd term for a tiny little country that is, you know, less than the size of Massachusetts. But they called it the realm. And this document laid out how it's important for Israel's defense, in other words, for it to be able to expand in the region, that it was very critical for Iraq and Syria to be taken out, to be weakened. And we can get into some of that history next time, but I'm just kind of fast forwarding here to this story about Syria. Because in the Middle East, you have what is mistakenly referred to as the Shia Arc, or the Northern Arc. It's not just Shia, you know, it's as many Sunnis as there are Shia, and there's millions of Christians and Yazidis and Druze and all, you know, all kinds of groups in there. So it's that Northern Arc of the Middle East, and that would be Palestine, Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, and Iran. And these countries of the Northern Arc are the strong countries. They're the more independent countries. They had the strongest armies. They have the deepest civilizations. Their civilizations go back, like I've said many times, to the dawn of civilization itself. They're societies that appreciate scholarship, learning, sciences, the arts, etc. These are the deep civilizations of that area. But those countries also, you know, Syria, Iraq, and Iran have the big armies. And as long as those countries have big armies, Israel's dreams of expansion can only go so far. So the leadership in Israel and the neocons in Washington wanted to come up with a plan for disabling those strong armies, and that would allow Israel to kind of do what they want in the region. So this document was written 1996, I think, this A Clean Break document. In 1997, years there, but the next year is when the neocon group formed into a group called the Project for the New American Century. And they wrote a manifesto, and the manifesto called for America to move into a preemptive war footing. Now, America, you know, this is not new for America. We have been at war for 220 of the last 240 years. Wars are what we do. But, you know, what the neocons wanted to do was basically they needed a golden ticket, a get-out-of-jail-free card to basically go in and wage war wherever they wanted to. And where they wanted to go to war was against these countries that stood up against Israel. The manifesto also included a very disturbing passage saying that the American public would not accept this idea of a preemptive war, just going around starting a war anywhere, without some kind of cataclysmic Pearl Harbor-like event. So we fast forward to the year 2001. George W. Bush has come into power. Dick Cheney and all of the neocons now are in charge of Washington. And General Wesley Clark, and most of you will know that name and the 7 countries in 5 years plan. But for those who don't, in 2007, General Wesley Clark, who was at one point the Supreme Commander of Allied Forces in Europe for NATO. So this is a guy who's as high as you can get, basically, at the Pentagon. He told the story of when, right after 9/11, he was in the Pentagon and one of his contacts talked to him or told him about this thing called the 7 countries in 5 years plan. The 7 countries that were targeted by the U.S. neocons for being taken down, for being disabled, for their armies getting weakened, for them to be turned into puppet states, for them to be basically taken control by the U.S. were Iraq, Libya, Lebanon, Syria, Sudan, Somalia, and ending with Iran. And of course, most of us know kind of some of the history after that. But what General Clark also revealed, what he also said in that interview, was that America had just gone through a coup that nobody knew about, that nobody was talking about. And this was the coup of the neocons taking control of our foreign policy, our intelligence agencies, our military, industrial complex, our Department of Defense. All of a sudden, we had these guys in power who wanted, like I said, a get-out-of-jail golden ticket card that said you can go to war anywhere you want. And that came in the form, after 9/11, of what's called the Authorized Use of Military Force, the AUMF. And basically the AUMF is saying, oh, we had these terrorists attack us on 9/11, and believe me, I have plenty of questions, and we'll do 9/11 sometime. But basically, since these terrorists attacked us, here you go, neocons. We're just giving you that golden ticket. We're giving you that get-out-of-jail-free card. You can go war anywhere you want in the world as long as you tell us there are terrorists there and you're fighting the terrorists. And so that's what happened, and that set the stage. Our country underwent a coup, and not enough people knew about this to be able to fight it. I know I was taken in by the whole post 9/11 propaganda routine. I thought I had to trust my government. I thought we were at war with these terrorists, blah, blah, blah. It was all lies. And that is what, so you go back to a clean break, you go back to the Project for the New American Century, you go back to the 7 countries in 7 years plan, and you finally end up with all of these invasions, all of these wars, all of these coups, and all of them under this mask of fighting this war on terror and you know, fighting Al-Qaeda, when in fact we have been sponsoring Al-Qaeda and sponsoring ISIS and sponsoring legions of terrorist groups in order to rip Syria apart for Israel, so that Syria's strong army cannot, that the hope was that Syria's strong army would be shredded and weakened. And what's happened after that has been nothing short of a miracle, because that did not happen. Syria's army defeated the terrorist groups and this plan to take control of it. I'm ready, Sid. So we're going to end it there for tonight. You know, I felt like I was kind of rambling there, but I hope there was some good information. I really appreciate everybody watching, comments. And here is Sid.
Hello.
Yay, you're happy, and that's a good thing.
This is my wife. Her name is Ramblin' Rose. Ramblin' Rose. Well,
Nice hat.
Oh, a personal thank you to the Syrian bus driver. Yusuf, my wife complimented his hat. Nice hat. My husband, he loves hats.
Here, come up close.
What comes home with my wife but my Syrian bus driver hat? The feature today is Zatar. Zatar. Well,
one of my favorites.
In Syria, let's just say if they say breakfast is ready, go. Just go. Breakfast is ready. And Jan has taken picture after picture after picture of the 20 different bowls on the table. And there's always Zatar. If you're a hippie from the 70s, you think this is one thing. If you're Syrian,
Oh, I love it.
Well, time grows like crazy, wild time. And so when the time is right, whoosh, you pick it. Then you got more time than you know what to do with. And they mix it with a sumac, toasted sesame seeds, and toasted ground chickpeas. And you take a piece of bread, you dip it in the beloved olive oil, you dip it in the zatar.
Delicious.
That is the best zatar I've had today. You know, as my wife was talking, a couple things came into my mind. And the big thing, if you want to keep a perspective, is like, who's the aggressor and who's defending? Does anyone have kids? You got kid A, you got kid B. Kid B is in kid A's room, and there's a whole lot of screaming going on, and you go in and you say, what's going on? Who started it? Well, kid B is going to say, well, kid A did it. And you're going, but you're in his room, stealing his stuff,
Good one.
antagonizing him. and accusing him. And who's the aggressor? Who's the antagonist? What's going on? So back before the Iraq War, and I mean, after 9/11, I remember at one point, my wife saw a bumper sticker that said, "Give war a chance." Do you remember that?
No, I don't.
Oh, you came home and said, "I saw the best bumper sticker. It's like, give war a chance." And I mean, you want to talk about, we had bought the whole thing. We bought the farm at that point. You said it, we believe it. I'm going to quote two leaders. Benjamin Netanyahu came in front of our Senate before the Iraq War and says, "I guarantee you, if you take out Saddam Hussein, it will have huge, beneficial, good, and lasting results over the whole region for a long time to come."
Enormous.
Enormous.
Yes.
Bigger than that. Enormous. And Coleman Powell flies over to Syria, sits down with Bashar al-Assad, asks him, will he join our clown show and take out Iraq? And Bashar al-Assad looks at Colin Powell, him too, and says, if you take out Saddam Hussein, Iraq will fall into an irreconcilable quagmire, and you'll be able to do nothing with it.
The whole world will have to extricate you. I don't think he said that to Colin Powell, but he said that at the same time.
So what you have is two brilliant men who could see the end results. One spoke in a reality, what's going to happen, and the other one spoke very clearly, this would be good for us. Good. You kill 1 million people, I'm sorry. If that's good for you, then I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Very sad, very sad.
Yeah, we don't want anything to do with that. That's for sure. And, you know, oh, shoot, what was I going to add to that? Actually, we've got some time. But, you know, what Colin Powell had told to Bashar al-Assad was that he had to, you know, if you basically helped us invade Iraq and take out Saddam, and if you ended your support for the resistance, so that was Hezbollah and Hamas, and kind of worked with our, you know, the Israelis, then...
And break your ties with Iran.
And then break your ties with Iran, you know, we'll let you stay in power kind of thing. And what Bashar al-Assad said was brilliant. You know what he said?
What did he say?
He said no.
And you know, if you say no to Colin Powell, and Colin Powell goes back to our beloved leader, George W. Bush, and said, Mr. President goes, what did he say? He says, he said no. At that point, Bush put Syria on the same list as North Korea.
The axis of evil. So
it went from the 5th safest country in the world to visit to on the same list. You know, how dare you as president go, if you're not for us, you're against us. Remember, who's the aggressor? We cross an ocean, we take out Iraq. We cross an ocean, we take out Libya. I don't see any freedom and democracy. We cross an ocean, we're still stealing Syrian oil. I don't see any freedom and democracy. We are the aggressors. Kid B, get out of Kid A's room and stop your lying.
And this brings us around to Zattar and Dr. Jaffrey. So I was kind of wandering around looking at things, and on my timeline comes up this ad for Israeli Zattar. And I had recently seen an ad for Israeli shawarma. And, you know, this is just so freaking typical that you have these quintessential Arab foods, these wonderful, fabulous foods, this great cuisine. And, you know, the Israelis are calling that theirs as well. And just recently, of course, they have applied pressure for the United States to recognize Syria's Golan as theirs. They've been squatting on that land for decades. Nobody else, no other country has ever recognized their right to that land. And they have finagled this guy, Donald J. Trump, to sign a piece of paper to call it Israeli land. And do you remember what Dr. Jaffari said? Dr. Jaffari,
at the UN.
He's the Syrian UN ambassador.
He's one of 3 sane people at the UN. He's not only sane, but he's more eloquent and smarter than anybody else there times 10. And, you know, if you're going to give something away, there's a big difference between whether you give something that's yours or I go steal a sheep from my neighbor. It's like, hey, you want a little lamb? Jaffrey says, why don't you give away North and South Carolina? I mean, at least they're yours to give away.
He's brilliant.
And once again, we've crossed an ocean. There's a wonderful book in the Old Testament called Deuteronomy. It's always been one of my favorite books. And there's a wonderful place in it where they're shouting back and forth across the valley. They're shouting the blessings and shouting the curses and da-da-da. And at one point it says, cursed is the man who moves his neighbor's boundary marker.
Well, that's actually how we're going to end it for tonight. But I just wanted to say, with the Zatar, that Israel, you can't have Zatar. That belongs to the region and the people of the region. And Israel, you cannot have the Golan. That belongs to Syria, and it will always be Syrian land. Palestine is land for the Palestinian people, and we are with you, and we love Zatar. Anything else we should say?
Well, Hillbilly A and Hillbilly Wife B, you know, we send you a blessing and happy Sunday evening. And
with your hat, cheers.
Cheers,
cheers everybody. Thank you so much. I don't think it's ending. There we go.